The UK is in an economic hole. Wages haven't increased in about 20 years. National debt is at its highest level since the end of the Second World War, and the wealthy are leaving the country after being taxed too heavily. And with the Labour budget coming shortly, more tax rises are almost certainly coming. Even after we already saw the largest peacetime tax raid in history just last year, it still wasn't enough, so more are coming. Now, we already know this. It's not news, it's not groundbreaking, but personally, I am very worried in particular about the state of the legacy media here in the UK and how distinctly illiterate they often are when it comes to basic economics and how they are trying actively to let Labour off for their failings. So today, we're going to watch a quick video put out by the notably left-wing biased Sky News, specifically about tax rises and the British economy and whether or not these tax rises and what's going to happen next to the UK. Now, I'm going to call them out every time they get something wrong, and I'll point out the important context that they're ignoring as well and try to make sure that we all know the truth. So here we are. Ed Conway's analysis: is raising taxes the only option for the Chancellor? Let's give it a go.
Well, the budget is coming up quite soon. It is going to be a really big deal, and I want to show you why. And you've got to remember that overhanging the issue for the UK economy are a couple of big issues. The first of them actually doesn't come back to the point of public finances. It comes back to the fact that UK growth basically isn't doing as well as...
This is a very interesting graph.
It's a long-running issue for the UK. Living standards just not going up as quickly as we might have.
But he doesn't give the full context.
Before the financial crisis, the trajectory for UK growth, and this line is basically just showing you how well off we are as an economy. It was kind of heading
would have been if the global financial crisis hadn't led to the Uni Party taking control.
And look, that went down, but critically, it never got back up to where that line is.
This is true. He's right here so far.
That's the trajectory kind of before the pandemic. It's going up, but it's never getting up to where it was before the financial crisis. And that's an issue. And on top of that issue, then the pandemic happens, and look, the same thing happened all over again. So we had that big dip. But
exactly.
That line is still really shy, first of all, from where it should be, or where it might have been if it carried on going pre-2008, where it was, and even here. And we'll come back to that in a second, but that is a big deal. 23%
smaller, first of all, does not mean our economy is 23% smaller. It means the economy is 23% poorer than it otherwise would have been if we hadn't had 15, 20 years of disastrous economic, just illiterate policy from the Conservatives and the Tories. But there's another problem with what he's shown here, because actually the problem is even worse than he lets off. This graph here, you can see, is the level of GDP, gross domestic product. That's a measure of the economy as a whole. What we really should be looking at is a measure of the economy on a per capita or per person basis, as in how much economic activity is each person in the UK responsible for on average. And when you take a look at that graph, it is notably worse. So what I'm showing you here is a graph released by the Financial Times going over most of the same period as what Sky News just showed you, but in particular they're measuring productivity within the British economy. So this accounts for how many hours the average person is working and how many people are in the economy. And you see again, similar, we see growth up until the global financial crisis and then a complete stagnation. The difference between this and what Sky News showed is Sky News are pretending that the graph is still going up, just at a slower rate, right? They're still showing it increasing, but that's only because of population growth. That's only because of immigration. When you take a look at this on a per capita basis, actually, it's almost entirely flat. The other really important thing is that Ed Conway in particular and Sky News, they really care about what the Office for Budget Responsibility think. They think that these bureaucrats sat in their office in Cardiff, Newport, Wales, wherever it is, are really good at their jobs and that they should be trusted. They should not. And again, this graph here proves it. These grey lines here, these pink lines, these yellow lines, these are the forecasts from the Office of Budget Responsibility, and you can see how repeatedly inaccurate and wrong they are. Every single month over the last decade, they have basically projected that we're going to get a lot richer. Even when they thought we were going to get a lot poorer than we did, they then expected us to get a lot richer afterwards. And every single month they've predicted this, they have been wrong as well. So be very careful when you hear in particular biased left-wing outlets like Sky News talking about forecasts or the OBR or the ONS, because they are not effective institutions. They are institutionally biased towards left-wing economic politics that just doesn't work in the real world. And so they continuously predict that we're going to get richer when we enact these left-wing economic policies, only for the actual result to be really bad.
That is a big deal. The second thing that's kind of overshadowing the UK at the moment is that
Now we're on to government debt, the cost of government debt.
Markets are charging the UK government to lend it money.
Again, he's going to show some pretty distinct bias here.
The key point to look at, this is the 30-year bond yield, so just kind of the interest rate on 30-year debt. And compare the UK to other countries around the G7. So that's what we've got here. The red line is the UK, and this area is the average, or the kind of
higher is obviously bad here.
Within the G7. And the key thing is, the UK used to be middle of the pack, so pretty average.
We did.
Then, actually coinciding with both the mini budget, but also the Bank of England reversing quantitative easing, the kind of programme.
Yes, so this spike here was Liz Truss's mini budget, where she basically said there's going to be massive tax cuts and there aren't going to be any spending cuts. So the government was going to have to borrow more money. Investors lost confidence and they demanded a higher premium for them lending money to the government, which is reflected in higher interest rates that the government has to pay. That's why it spiked up there, but it did then fall back down a little bit. But the situation continued to get worse over the rest of the Tories' terms, as basically we kept spending more money as a government and we just weren't growing as an economy. So the prospect of us paying off our debt, the government's debt, just gets worse, and investors demand a higher premium for that. We ended up being at the top of this bound, but be very careful here, because Ed Conway is going to completely, ignore the fact that yes, we are now above this line, but that is entirely Labour's fault. He literally, I think, dedicates 3 or 4 seconds to mentioning that this part, we were at the top of the G7 limits here. This part onwards is under Labour, and he barely mentions it at all.
Easing, the kind of programme where it's kind of pumping money into the market, the UK suddenly goes from being middle of the pack to kind of top of the pack. And then in the last kind of year and a bit, more or less actually since Labour came in.
That's it. That's his entire mention of how maybe Labour might be a part of the problem here. And again, this here saying that it's getting better over the last few weeks, that's nonsense. This is completely statistically insignificant. There is not enough data here to work off. And you can see, actually, this gap is still larger than it has been over the majority of the last year. It's just gotten better from where it was 2 or 3 months ago, very, very slightly.
But and the gap is a little bit narrower than it was before, but we're still an outlier.
And what being outside this blue line means is that we have the most expensive government debt out of any major advanced economy. America and Canada and China and all these big important economies, basically, when our government borrows money, they have to pay more in interest for it than any other government in the world, because of how irresponsible and untrustworthy and just illiterate the Labour Party are.
We're still shy of everyone else. So those are the kind of two things to have in your mind. It's worth just saying, when markets are kind of looking at this, there's one possible explanation which says it's mostly about the monetary system. What does that mean? It means it's mostly about interest.
So here we are. He's blaming inflation. And again, he's going to make a massive, massive bias statement here. Inflation is a product of supply and demand within an economy, right? Prices are always a product of supply and demand. And when you have too much demand and not enough supply, basically that means that prices are going to rise, and that causes inflation. That is almost always dependent on government policy. Again, Ed Conway here is going to try and detach inflation from the Labour government and pretend that they aren't related and that we just have inflation because we have high inflation and no other reason, when in reality it is distinctly the fault of the Labour government.
And here, actually, this is quite a compelling case. It says that, and this is the bank...
So he's actually going one step further, sorry. He's saying that the high interest rates that we're having to pay is because of inflation and not because of the Labour Party, when in reality, it's both. Yes, inflation causes higher interest rates, but the Labour Party are causing higher inflation, which then causes higher interest rates.
The Bank of England's job to deal with this. This is the inflation rate in the UK. Again, it's a similar comparison here. So the red line is the UK. That other kind of area here is the rest of the G7, so other industrialised economies. And look, the UK has broken free of the pack with the highest...
Again, this so happens to be exactly the point where Labour came into power. The Tories were economically disastrous for our country, but they weren't quite as bad as Labour were. They had that massive spike after COVID, and then they started to rein it all in, and it was getting better. The second Labour come into power, suddenly inflation starts to skyrocket again. It is impossible to detach that reality from the fact that that's what happened under a Labour government.
Highest in the G7 when it comes to inflation. So you could say, look, actually, this is primarily markets making a statement about what's going on with inflation. Not really anything to do with Rachel Reeves.
Not anything to do with Rachel Reeves.
She has an issue as well. And here, Everything comes back to...
Now we're getting into tax raises.
This is one of these
budgets.
slightly maddening topics we've talked about quite a lot in recent years. And what is headroom? Basically, the Chancellor has fiscal rules, not just this one, but previous Chancellors as well. They've set themselves rules to try and ensure that they're not going to kind of overspend and the markets take them seriously. And in the case of this Chancellor, she's got a few rules, but the most important of them right now is that she wants to get the current budget from a deficit, where it is at the moment. So the current budget is basically just how much you're spending minus how much taxes are coming in, ignoring investment. Currently a deficit, but it's planned in the future to get up into a surplus. They often say it's getting into a surplus, by the way. It doesn't whether it actually gets
It
to a surplus.
never happens, in fact.
Nonetheless,
And again, I want to draw your attention to the source for this here, the Office for Budget Responsibility, the same organisation, Office for Budget Responsibility, that made these continuous, repeated, incredibly inaccurate reports over productivity growth in the UK over the last 2 decades. They are institutionally bankrupt, morally captured, ideologically captured by the left, and completely inept at doing their job and giving us accurate forecasts.
in the final year of the forecast horizon, that needs to be in a surplus territory. And right now, it is, at least according to the figures, the latest budget figures.
According to the OBR's inherently incorrect figures, which are always incorrect. Keep that in mind, please.
Figures, which were kind of about 6 months ago. And that's where the issue comes. Okay, so £9.9 billion, you might recognise that number, because that is headroom. So when people talk about headroom, the Chancellor's headroom, it's this. It's all about how much she has, how much room she has not to break her fiscal rules, which so happens to be just the current budget deficit at the end of the forecast horizon. So if we take that and think about headroom and think about how much room she has before she breaks her rules and everyone starts to panic, or maybe they don't panic, this is where it is, or at least it was back in March, £9.9 billion. But of course, a lot of things have happened since then. So, let's just say, looking back in previous
The economy
years,
is much weaker.
much
He won't say
more
it, but that's the
leeway.
truth.
The fact that she left herself 9.9
The reality is that actually the economy has gotten much weaker over the last year, but Ed Conway isn't going to come out and say that because, again, he's trying to play cover for the Labour Party.
£9 billion. That was her own decision. She left herself a quite wafer-thin margin against that rule. But nonetheless, it's £9.9 billion. And if you kind of work out what's happened since then. So first of all, back to the chart I showed you kind of earlier on. Interest rates are higher. And if interest rates are higher, you're having to pay more in debt interest. So your headroom goes down.
That's correct.
Spend a bit more. On top of that, you've got things like the fact that, remember all those commitments? There are all those commitments like winter fuel.
Again,
welfare,
correct.
Welfare. It didn't happen. And as a result of that, the government's having to spend more money. It might come to about £10 billion. These numbers are slightly ballpark. No one knows for sure what they're actually going to be. We're only going to learn what they actually are in the budget. But for the time being, this gives you a sense of what we're talking about. Maybe £10 billion or so, taking you down. So the rule is no longer met. It's broken. It's broken.
And when this rule isn't met, the Labour Party's only choice is basically to admit that they're financially incapable of running a country or to raise taxes. They have to choose one of the two. They're never going to admit that they're failing, so they're going to raise taxes instead, which means your money paying for Labour socialist failings.
Only the start of it, because there's other things going on. The Chancellor and the Prime Minister have kind of committed to doing things like getting rid of the two-child limits on certain benefits. That's another £5 billion if you include a few other things they've committed to. So again, you're down even further into negative territory. And finally, that chart we started up right at the start, the fact that the economy isn't growing as fast as previously assumed. The Office of Budget Responsibility, who do the forecast for the government, they are doing their latest look at just the state of the public finance and the state of the economy, and they're likely to say, look, the economy's not running as fast as we thought it was. As a result of that, we're downgrading our kind of assumption for productivity. Bang, another £10 billion. Could be even more, by the way, another £10 billion.
Again, the OBR's forecast is always better than it ends up being because they are playing cover for this leftist government. And so even a £10 billion forecast downgrade is not as bad as the real situation. We're talking 2029 to 30, 4 to 5 years into the future at this point. And again, this is the graph showing you how inaccurate this organisation is when it comes to predicting the economy in the future. They never get it right. They won't get it right this time. And they never get it wrong in a good way. They never predict that we're not going to grow and then we end up getting much richer, right? They always get it wrong the wrong way, which means this £10 billion is likely, by the time we get to 2029 or 30, if Labour stay in power that whole time, going to be something like 30 to 40 billion pound downgrades instead.
By the way, another £10 billion or so. If it is £10 billion, you're down. You've gone from £9.9 billion meeting the rule to £17.1 billion breaking the rule. So you're a long way short. And as I say, it could be even worse. Some of those are relatively conservative, those assumptions, and you could be down kind of even further into the red. We really just don't know until the numbers come around. But even assuming it's at that kind of medium level, that's a big bridge, a big gap to bridge.
And this is why it's such a certainty that we're going to see tax rises.
Tax rises and spending cuts. And if you want,
and in particular, why I'm so sure that this is going to be tax rises and not spending cuts is because Labour like to attack people who have money, and their entire ideological base is, consistent around giving away free money. Last year, when Labour actually tried to cut benefits, right, they tried to, reduce the winter fuel payments, and they tried to reduce PIP payments, the Labour Party themselves are the ones who rebelled and stopped that from happening. So it's very, very unlikely that we see any kind of spending cuts, which means it's not tax rises or spending cuts, it's just tax rises that are to come at this budget.
You wanted to get back. So let's say that she, rather than going for £9.9 billion like she did last time around, let's say she goes for £20 billion, so she has more headroom, and it's more sensible. If you're doing that, it's even more money you need to
We're
raise.
already in the realm of some of the biggest tax rises in history here.
And that, of course, raises the big question. How do you fill that hole? How do you get £30 billion? And the short answer here is, if you were just wanting to do it as easily as possible with as few measures as possible, you do the really unpopular stuff, which raises a lot of money, like raising basic rate of income tax. And if you raise the basic rate of income tax by a penny...
Unfortunately, Ed's actually a little bit right here.
You could as well raise...
The easiest way to raise money is with the big popular taxes.
Not as much money, out there in the economy, but nonetheless, another, couple of £1 billion, £2-3 billion. But if you really wanted to raise a load of money, you could raise VAT by 2%. I'm not saying they should do any of this stuff. I'm just saying this is the easiest path to fill a massive hole. This is a massive...
It's not only the easiest path, it's the most reliable as well. And I'll explain a little bit more about this in a moment, because he's in a moment going to talk about some of the smaller tax raises he's going for. But think about how difficult it is to avoid value-added tax, right? If they increased VAT by 2%, you just pay an extra 2% on everything on your weekly shop. On everything you buy, you just pay an extra 2%. It's incredibly difficult to change your behavior to avoid that tax. When it comes to something like an exit tax or capital gains tax, right, for entrepreneurs who could just move to Dubai tomorrow, it's much easier for them to change their behavior to avoid that tax, which means when the Chancellor says, I'm going to raise taxes, by £10 billion in capital gains, well, people just change their behavior and she doesn't raise the £10 billion she expects to. That's one of the big reasons that there's been this massive downgrade and why she needs to raise more taxes again. Income tax as well, it's very difficult to dodge income tax. You have a job, you live in the UK, the only real way to dodge income tax is to change your job and get paid in cash instead. That's not very easy for most people, or move out of the country. Again, that's a really big impact for someone who maybe doesn't own a business, but they work in someone else's business. It's hard for them to find a job in Dubai or Italy or the US or something like that. Whereas for the wealthy people, and the taxes that they're trying to target, things like an exit tax for entrepreneurs, it's incredibly easy for them to skirt around these taxes.
Because this is a massive hole, like about £30 billion. But that brings us to whether they actually will do anything like this. And the short answer is no one expects them to do anything quite like that. It's worth just saying, the reason that those taxes I just mentioned a moment ago really matter is if you look at the total amount of taxes coming in, so this is just total amount of taxes expected in the final year of the forecast horizon, about £1.4 trillion. This is kind of what they comprise of. So the majority of it is income tax, national insurance, which is kind of, another kind of companion to income tax, and VAT. And then you've got corporation tax there. So these taxes, the reason I've marked them in red is these are the taxes that the Chancellor has kind of indicated are ring-fenced, that they're not likely to raise the rates of. But the issue is that, you can see it right there, they comprise 60% of total revenues. If you're raising any taxes, it's very hard to just focus on this stuff.
He's also just ignoring the fact that, again, all taxes are a product. And people have a choice of whether or not they want to pay for that product, right? What does the government give us? That's the service they deliver, filling in potholes, policing criminals. They don't really do it at the moment, which is one of the reasons so many people are leaving. And the price we pay for that is the tax. The issue is corporation tax is a separate product to income tax. And say I run a business, right? It's relatively successful, I make a bit of money. It would actually be relatively easy for me to set the business up in Dubai and move there and do the exact same work. I can take this bookshelf with me to Dubai, right? I can set up my camera there. I can make all the exact same videos there that I can here. And so there's nothing really keeping me in the UK except for just patriotism. I want to stay here. I love my country and I don't want to run away and let it fall into the abyss. The issue is that she's only allowing herself to change the taxes for products which are easy to avoid. Things like capital gains tax. Another example of that is last year she raised capital gains tax by about 20% on average. If you were going to pay £100,000 in capital gains tax 2 years ago, under the Labour changes that came into power in 2024 in the last budget, you would have ended up paying something like £120,000. So a 20% increase in capital gains tax rates in what they're trying to collect. The amount of capital gains that Labour actually collected went down by £1 billion. It went from around about £13 billion to around about £12 billion, despite Labour raising the tax rates by 20%. How is that possible? Are people dodging their tax? No. They're not dodging their tax. They're not doing anything illegal. Capital gains taxes are only paid when you sell something for more than you bought it for. So if you own a bunch of stocks, well, when they raise capital gains taxes, you just don't sell the stocks this time and you don't pay the tax. Right? When you buy a house in London and then it rises in value by £1 million over the last 20 years, well, when Labour announced that they're raising capital gains tax, you just don't sell the house this time and then there's zero tax to pay. And so the other problem, and again, Ed Conway isn't going to talk about because this is antithetical to left-wing ideology, is that these taxes here are really easy to avoid just by changing your behaviour, by not selling that house, by not selling those shares, right? By moving your company to a different state in a different country or a different region, or even moving it to somewhere like Jersey or Guernsey where you're still in the UK, but it's not under the same tax regime as the rest of the mainland country. So again, Ed Conway isn't being totally faithful here.
But that might be what they're committed to. And if you're just focusing on this stuff or doing a little bit of fiddling with the stuff over there, here's one way you might be able to get towards that £30 billion. So you could reduce the spending plans in 2029 to 30. It brings in maybe about £5 billion. They haven't been committed to. It's a relatively easy thing to do. Every chancellor has done that for a long time. It's not
These are the kind of changes Sky News are expecting. And they're fairly accurate. I expect similar changes.
About that. You could freeze the 2029 to 30 personal allowances, tax-free personal allowances. The government made
This is a stealth tax on employing people, on income, on working people.
But nonetheless, it's a tax rise that isn't raising the rate, so they could do that. There's
It's a
other
stealth
little bitty
tax.
things. You can have a higher rate of council tax. It's very, a lot of people would notice that.
The other big problem with this idea that Labour seems to be pushing for, doing lots of smaller taxes, is that you're hurting pretty much everyone in the country. A higher rate of council tax there, you see how small of a gain that is. It's £1 or £2 billion extra a year they'd get, but it's going to hit the headlines all over the country and it's going to piss off millions and millions of voters. The exact same thing happened with the farmers' protests last year, right? They only raised £500 million. We need 30 billion. That's 30,000 million pounds that we need here. And with the farmer tax rate on the inheritance tax they did last year, they raised only 500, and it was in the news for weeks on end, and it tanked Labour's polling. They're going to get the exact same thing when they raise things like council tax or when they freeze the levels for different things going forward.
Money from it, but nonetheless, you could do that. There's other things. You could close council CGT loopholes, so capital gains tax loopholes, people leaving the country. You could raise a bit of money out of that. You could raise a bit of money by charging national insurance.
This is just basically charging lawyers and professionals more money, so working people still.
Tax, for instance, or a lot of talk about this, higher rate income tax, so putting that up.
Barely anything raised.
They're getting you very.
They have to attack 50% of the country.
Target, rather than doing it in one fell swoop. And you've still got a gap, a £7 billion gap. And that's perhaps why a lot of people are wondering whether the Chancellor is going to go ahead and do something big with income tax. But here's the kind of broader issue that overshadows the UK economy right now. If you look at the total amount of tax we're facing right now, this is just taxes as a percentage of GDP.
This is the tax burden.
It is the highest on record, or at least it's kind of heading for the highest level.
If there's £100 in the economy and they're moving around, that £100 is going into your pocket and then you spend it at a cafe, and then the person who owns the cafe spends it, on a new car, and then the person who sold you the car spends it on something else. If there's £100 in the economy, 38 of those pounds currently go to the government. The government takes it out of the economy and spends it on useless stuff themselves. That is the highest we've seen since the Second World War, as you can see from this graph. Ridiculous levels here. Incredibly inefficient. Every pound spent by the government is always inherently inefficient as well. So this is always a bad thing to see this line going up. We should want it to sit around about the 25% mark, all the way below this graph.
Look, like I say, other countries around the world, many other countries have higher levels of taxation. Some have lower. The UK's kind of middle of the pack on this. So there's nothing to say that the UK, that bar couldn't move up.
Except it's inefficient to raise that bar. It's bad for the country. Just because we can, destroy ourselves even quicker like France are, doesn't mean we should.
When you look at previous budgets, and this is all the fiscal events going back to the 2010s, and you can see the George Osborne period here, where there were a lot of budgets that were doing what's known as fiscal tightening. So tightening the belt, basically austerity, for want of a better word. Those bars were low, down, down, down. And then you had more giveaways in subsequent years. That's the pandemic there. here's what's interesting. If you assume it's going to be a kind of £30 billion-ish takeaway, so money coming out of people's pockets to raise all that cash, the bar could well be as low as this.
There we are. Huge austerity. Huge austerity under Labour right now.
Back to the George Osborne era. We don't know, as I say. We're still waiting. All of this is speculation. Massive spoiler alert. This is speculation. But, until...
This is one of the big problems that Labour are facing right now, actually. I'll try and get a good screenshot which allows us to see this well. This period here is austerity under the Conservative government, which was ineffective. It strangled our economy. It stopped us from getting richer. They also allowed mass immigration to take place, which again stopped the economy from getting richer. And they didn't invest into essential things like new prisons to keep us safe and new police officers to actually put those criminals in jail and things. So this period of British politics here was disastrous. And that was austerity. Each line going down, that's how much money basically the government is taking away from the economy. Each line going up, that's the government adding money to the economy. This here is greater than any of those years or months of austerity, apart from when the Tories first came into power and there was literally no money left after the last time Labour were in government. Now, what a lot of people don't understand is that austerity is not just cutting spending, it is also raising taxes. Those two things are, on a monetary point of view, from fiscal policy, are exactly the same. You are pulling wealth away from the economy, you are strangling the economy. And so this here is, without a doubt, austerity under the Labour government. That's one of the reasons Labour are so unpopular, because they think there's a difference between raising taxes and cutting spending, when in reality, there just isn't. Anyway, that's it for today's video. Went on a little bit. I hope that was interesting. If it is, please let me know if I should do more videos like this. I've been thinking about maybe making a little community, a Patreon, where people can submit videos or articles or stories for me to take a look at. Maybe that's a good way for me to work out what I should be talking about. But I thought this was a really interesting video. And I felt that there weren't outright lies by Sky News here, but there were many lies by omission, right? Refusing to acknowledge that actually this does all go back to the Labour government being in power and them destroying our country. If you have any things you'd like me to cover, leave it down below in the comments. If you really want to help me out and help this channel grow, share this video with a friend, a family member, a co-worker. Let someone else know the truth about the economy, and to also see how the legacy media just does these subtle little manipulations to try and trick you into thinking that left-wing economics might actually work. Zoran Mamdani, an immigrant Islamist socialist, has recently won the election to become mayor of New York. For the first time, the Democratic Party in the United States has really lost control of the party to the extreme left wing. And there are many leftists and socialists here in the UK in particular celebrating this. They're expecting this to lead to a similar sort of populist